All right, so are you ready to dive deep? Because today we are really getting to the heart of what makes a nation tick.
Sounds exciting.
We've got some fascinating source material here, comparing and contrasting the core values of Canada and the U.S.
Right.
And get this, it argues that these differences go way beyond just like historical facts.
Oh.
It's saying they actually shape national identity culture, even individual choices.
Yeah, it's amazing how the source frames this.
Hmm.
It's not just kind of a neutral comparison.
Right.
It's really laying out a bold argument about how different founding principles can lead to dramatically different outcomes for nations and for people.
Definitely. So let's unpack this a little bit. The source material starts with Canada.
Okay.
And it attributes 4 key principles to Canada's foundation, loyalty, order, duty, and honoring ancestors. I have to say, at first glance, these sound a little bit traditional.
Yeah, they do have kind of a traditional ring to them.
Yeah.
But when you start to look at how the source connects these principles to actual historical events, it gets really interesting. Like, think about how Canada expanded westward, for example.
Okay.
They used the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to establish order before the wave of settlers came in.
That's a pretty striking contrast to the American Wild West narrative that I think we're all pretty familiar with.
Exactly.
Like Canada was saying, hold on, let's set up some rules of the game first before everyone rushes in.
Exactly. And that approach really speaks directly to this principle of order.
Right.
But the source goes even deeper, suggesting that this emphasis on order wasn't just about practicality. It was deeply intertwined with this idea of loyalty.
Okay.
So in Canada, loyalty to the crown wasn't just symbolic.
Yeah.
It represented this connection to a larger history and a sense of duty to something beyond oneself.
So it's not just about those individual pioneers striking out on their own right. It was about being part of something bigger, contributing to a collective effort.
Precisely.
Hmm.
The source argues that this sense of duty extended to the very concept of Canada's statehood.
Oh, interesting.
So it wasn't just about breaking away from Britain and declaring independence. It was about stepping up and assuming the responsibilities of a nation within a larger empire.
That is a completely different way of framing national identity.
Yeah.
It's not just about freedom from something, it's about responsibility to something.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the United States.
Okay.
And this is where the source really throws down the gauntlet.
Oh, boy.
It labels American values as anti-principles, which I have to admit, that's a pretty provocative way to put it.
It definitely grabs your attention.
Yeah.
But before we dismiss it as just sensationalism, I think we need to really delve into what the source actually means by anti-principles.
All right, hit me with it. What are these so-called anti-principles of America?
All right, so the source lists 4.
Okay.
Fratricide, deicide, chaos, and the worship of money.
Wow.
I know these terms sound extreme,
Right.
almost biblical in their intensity. But if we kind of unpack them carefully, I think we can see how the source is using them to paint a very specific picture of American identity.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's start with fratricide. How does that even apply to a nation?
Well, the source connects this concept to some major events in American history,
Okay.
like the American Revolution and the Civil War.
Uh-huh.
It argues that these conflicts where Americans were literally fighting against each other
Yeah.
reveal this deep-seated tension within the American psyche,
Okay.
a lack of a truly unifying national identity.
So instead of that shared sense of loyalty and duty to a greater whole, like we see in Canada, the emphasis in America is more on individual interests, even if it leads to conflict.
That's the argument the source is making.
And then it gets even more provocative with the next anti-principle, deicide. I will
Right.
admit, when I first read that one, my eyebrows shot up.
Mine too. Deicide the killing of God.
Right.
Pretty loaded term.
Yeah. How does the source even begin to justify applying that to America?
Well, it's crucial to understand that the source is using deicide symbolically here,
Okay.
not literally.
Got it.
It's not saying that America literally killed God,
Right.
but rather that it rejected traditional God-given authority.
Okay.
So the argument is that the American Revolution at its core was a rejection of the king's authority, which at the time was seen as divinely ordained.
So it's like America was saying, we don't need a king. We don't need this hierarchical system. We, the people, can govern ourselves, which in the context of the time was a pretty radical idea.
Absolutely. And this leads directly into the third anti-principle, chaos.
Okay.
The source suggests that this rejection of traditional authority creates a vacuum, which is then filled by a focus on individual ambition and the pursuit of wealth.
So instead of order and duty, you have this free-for-all, everyone scrambling for their own piece of the pie.
Exactly.
And how does that play out in American society?
Well, that brings us to the final anti-principle, the worship of money. And the source argues that this becomes the dominant value in American culture, shaping everything from social status to artistic expression.
Wow.
It even suggests that money becomes the measure of success, overshadowing other values like community, tradition, even morality.
That's a pretty stark assessment. So it's not just about individual ambition, it's about a system that elevates wealth above all else. And how does this worship of money manifest itself in real life? What specific examples does the source give?
The source is full of examples, but one that stands out is the pressure that it claims is put on American artists and musicians to produce commercially viable work. So instead of being free to pursue their own creative visions, they're often pushed towards what sells, what appeals to the masses.
So instead of creating art that challenges, inspires, provokes, they're essentially churning out products designed for mass consumption. It's like the market dictates what kind of art gets made.
Exactly. And the source points to this as evidence of how this worship of money permeates American culture, potentially stifling creativity and leading to a decline in artistic standards.
It's a pretty controversial claim, I'll grant you that. But I can see how that pressure to succeed financially could lead to a focus on commercial success over artistic merit. And this leads to a really interesting question. If the worship of money is so central to American identity, how does that impact its role in the world? Does this kind of inward focus on individual success translate into a certain kind of foreign policy?
It's a great question, and it's something the source tackles head on.
Okay.
It argues that America's emphasis on individualism and the pursuit of wealth has a profound impact on its approach to international relations.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Let's dive into that in our next segment. All right, so we just left off with this idea that America's focus on individualism and wealth might actually shape its foreign policy.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold claim.
So what exactly is the source saying here?
Well, it argues that America feels this need almost like an obligation to spread its values worldwide. It's not content to simply exist as one nation among many. It sees its system as the best, the most advanced, and therefore feels this need to export it to the rest of the world.
So it's not just about protecting its own interests, it's also about promoting its ideology, almost like a missionary impulse.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the source contrasts this with Canada's historical role, where sense of duty was more about fulfilling its obligations within a larger system.
Right.
So Canada was kind of content to play its part, while America seems to constantly strive to reshape the global landscape in its own image.
It's interesting how this ties back to those core principles we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Canada's loyalty and duty kind of directed inward, while America's individualism seems to project outward. But isn't that a rather simplistic view? I mean, surely America's foreign policy is driven by more than just ideology.
Of course, it's a complex issue with many factors at play.
Right.
But the source is arguing that this ideological component is a significant driving force. It even goes so far as to say that this belief in the superiority of American values can lead to a certain blindness to the nuances of other cultures and political systems.
So it's like America's conviction in its own righteousness can sometimes cloud its judgment? And how does that actually play out in real-world situations?
Well, the source uses the example of military intervention.
Okay.
It suggests that America is more likely to intervene in situations where it perceives its values to be under threat, even if those interventions ultimately lead to more chaos and instability.
It's interesting that you use the word chaos because that connects back to one of those anti-principles that the source attributed to America.
Right.
Do you think there's a link between this internal chaos that the source describes and America's actions on the world stage?
It's an intriguing connection.
Right.
The source doesn't explicitly make that link,
right,
but it certainly raises the question of whether a nation that kind of embraces a certain level of internal chaos might be more prone to projecting that chaos outward.
Definitely food for thought, for sure. But let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about international relations, but what about the impact of these contrasting values on something like culture? What does the source have to say about that?
Well, this is where the source gets really controversial.
Okay.
It makes this bold claim, arguing that America actually lacks high culture.
Wow.
It suggests that this emphasis on individualism and the worship of money has led to a decline in artistic standards.
Wow. That's a pretty harsh critique. Isn't that a bit of an overgeneralization? I mean, America has produced some of the world's most iconic artists and musicians.
It's true, there's no shortage of talent in America.
Right.
But the source's argument is that the system itself is kind of stacked against them. So this pressure to succeed commercially, to appeal to the masses, often trumps artistic integrity.
So it's not a lack of talent, but rather a lack of space for that talent to flourish outside the constraints of the market.
It's exactly. The source points to examples like musicians being forced to write jingles, or artists creating work that's essentially just a rehash of popular culture.
Right.
It paints this picture of a culture where creativity is stifled by the demands of commerce.
It's almost like they're trapped in this cycle of producing what sells rather than what inspires. It's like that old saying, starving artist. But in this case, it's not about literal starvation. It's about a starvation of artistic freedom.
That's a really insightful way to put it. And the source suggests that this phenomenon is a direct consequence of America's core values.
Yeah.
This emphasis on individual success and material wealth.
Yeah.
Over things like tradition, community, and artistic exploration for its own sake.
That's a pretty bleak assessment, but it does make you wonder, if there's a connection between this cultural starvation that the source describes and the growing number of Americans who seem to be turning towards more traditional forms of faith. It's like they're searching for something deeper than what mainstream American culture offers.
That's an interesting observation. The source does touch on this, pointing to the rise of Orthodox Christianity and traditional Catholicism as potential indicators of this growing disillusionment with the dominant values of American society.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're seeking a different set of roots, a connection to something that feels more enduring, more meaningful.
They've explored these contrasting national identities, Canada and the U.S., through the lens of history, foreign policy, even culture.
Right.
But what does this all mean for individuals?
That's the big question.
How do these big, abstract ideas about national character actually impact people's lives, their choices, their sense of belonging?
This is where things get really personal, because the source isn't just an academic exercise. It's deeply informed by the author's own internal struggle. He seems to be torn between admiring aspects of American culture while at the same time rejecting its core values.
It's like he sees the appeal, the dynamism, the energy of America, but ultimately can't reconcile himself to the underlying principles that drive it.
Right.
And that tension, that inner conflict, is something I think a lot of people can probably relate to.
Yeah, I think so.
Even if you don't agree with the source's conclusions, it raises some really important questions about how we navigate the relationship between our own personal values and the values of the society we live in.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this source so compelling, you know?
Right.
It's not just a dry analysis of national character. It's a personal exploration of what it means to grapple with values that feel out of sync with the dominant culture.
It's a deep dive into not just national identity, but personal identity as well.
Yeah.
And that's something I think we can all learn from, regardless of where we come from or what we believe. But let's explore this a bit further. How does the source suggest we navigate this tension between personal values and the prevailing values of our culture? We were just talking about that tension the source author feels, between his own values and the values he sees as dominant in American culture.
Yeah.
It's something I think a lot of people can probably relate to, even if they haven't really thought about it in quite these terms.
It's a really human dilemma, right? Trying to figure out where you fit in when the values that you hold dear seem to clash with the values that you see all around you.
Yeah, it's like trying to find solid ground when the earth beneath you feels unsteady.
Exactly.
So how does the source suggest we deal with this tension? Does it offer any kind of guidance?
Well, it doesn't give like a step-by-step guide or anything.
Yeah.
But it does highlight some interesting ways that people are navigating this dilemma.
Okay.
We talked earlier about this rise of traditional forms of Christianity in America.
Yeah.
And the source frames this as a potential response to this perceived emptiness of a culture that's so focused on individual success and material wealth.
Right.
So it's like people are seeking a different kind of anchor, something that feels more grounded, more enduring.
It's almost like a quiet rebellion, isn't it?
Yeah.
Choosing to opt out of that dominant value system and find meaning somewhere else. And it makes me think about those founding principles that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
You know, if a nation is built on a certain set of values,
Right.
what happens when those values start to erode, or when a significant portion of the population just doesn't really subscribe to them anymore?
Yeah, that's a huge question.
Yeah.
And one that I don't think has an easy answer.
Right.
The source doesn't really delve into like the potential societal consequences,
Yeah.
but it does imply that this disconnect between individual values and national values can create a sense of unease, a feeling that something is out of balance.
Yeah, it's like a crack in the foundation. A subtle but growing fissure that kind of threatens the stability of the whole structure.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
So what can we do about it? As individuals, how can we navigate this really complex landscape of competing values?
Well, I think the source, even if it doesn't explicitly state this,
Yeah.
it encourages us to be more intentional, more conscious of the choices that we make.
Okay.
It's easy to just get swept along by the current, to conform to the expectations of our culture, without really stopping to question whether those expectations actually align with our own values.
Yeah, it's like we're on this conveyor belt just being carried along towards a destination we didn't choose.
Exactly.
But the source seems to be saying, hey, you can step off the conveyor belt.
Right.
You can choose a different path.
Exactly. And that takes courage, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
It takes a willingness to kind of question the status quo, to challenge assumptions, and to potentially face resistance from those who are comfortable with the way things are.
It's not the easy path, that's for sure. But it's the path of authenticity, isn't it? It's the path of staying true to yourself, even when it means swimming against the tide. And maybe, just maybe, it's the path that leads to a more fulfilling, more meaningful life.
And who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe those individual choices, those acts of quiet rebellion, can ultimately contribute to a shift in the broader culture.
Right.
You know, if enough people start stepping off the conveyor belt, maybe we can redirect the flow, create a new path that's more aligned with the values we want to see in the world.
That's a hopeful thought, that individual choices can have this ripple effect and create a wave of change that transforms the whole fire. So listeners, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this. What are the values that truly matter to you? And are you living a life that reflects those values? If not, what can you do starting today to bridge that gap, to align your actions with your beliefs? It's a journey worth taking, even if it means charting your own course. Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep growing. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.